This is my grandmother, Charlotte Satt-Murray, but she is known to everyone as Shari or almost to her grandchildren. Although she just appears to be an ordinary woman, she lived through extraordinary times. She has showed initiative and courage, and it is truly a miracle that she lives today enjoying life in the eastern suburbs with her 4 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren, all of whom adore her. Shari was born on the 2nd of May 1922 in a small village called Erihodosh. My grandmother was the youngest of 6 children in her family. Her eldest brother, Emery, in the middle, followed by Helen on the left, Rosie far right, Olga next to Rosie, and Alexander on the far left. And then my grandmother is sitting on Helen's lap. When Shari was 4 years old, they moved to St. Gotthard, which was a small town close to the Austrian border. Her family lived in poverty. However, even though her family were poor, they never realized, as there was always food on the table. In 1938, the Germans occupied Austria, so my grandmother's family moved to Budapest. Whilst living there, my grandmother started working as a dressmaker, a trade she learned after she left school at the age of 12. In this photo, you see my grandmother laying in the sun, enjoying early life in Budapest. Here she is at 17, with not a care in the world. My grandmother was a beautiful woman, and she had no idea what was going to happen in the near future. When Germany took over Austria, many Jews immigrated to Budapest and told horror stories about what was happening to the Jews there. My grandmother's family never thought that something so horrible could happen to them, and didn't know that the next few years would be the hardest. The killing of millions of Jews and other non-Aryans in the Holocaust during World War II was the greatest crime against humanity recorded in history. My grandmother and her family were living relatively peaceful lives until the 15th of March 1944, when the Germans occupied Hungary. They made restrictions to the Jews and then announced that all Jews were only allowed to live in certain ghettos. During this time, many Jews were deported to different camps. Money was running very low and it was hard to earn an income. Her family were always hungry. On the 1st of October 1944, the Hungarian Nazis took control, and that's when the terrible things started to happen. George Satt-Murray, who by now was my grandmother's fiancé, and his family were hiding in an apartment and had Christian papers. My grandmother stayed with him for a few days, however the Hungarian Nazis found out about it and severely beat them. George never recovered from some of the injuries he received and was sent to Bergen-Belsen. My grandmother escaped to Buda to get help. My grandmother's cousin Stephen worked in a hospital and hid them in the cellar, but after a few days they were discovered by the Black Arrow and they severely beat my grandmother and sisters. They were sentenced to 30 days in jail for hiding. They stayed in jail for 2 weeks, whereupon the whole jail populace was forced to march towards Germany. The guards were very cruel to them, and if they stopped to rest, they would be shot. They marched for 6 days until they arrived in a big city called Komárom. My grandmother and her sisters planned to escape. My grandmother was the first to escape, and while the death march continued, she jumped into a ditch and waited until all the people marched away from sight. She ended up in a small village near the city. The people in the village told her the Nazi soldiers were asking everyone for ID and papers, so my grandmother had to travel back to Komárom. There, she had to seek refuge in an unused pub where people were waiting to be transported back to Budapest. To her joy, the first people she saw there were her 2 sisters Rose and Helen, and her cousin Stephen. They spent 2 months on the run, living in abandoned houses and fending for themselves in the harsh European winter. On the 21st of March 1945, my grandmother and her family decided to walk back to Budapest. They finally arrived in Pest on the 23rd, and the city had been liberated by the Russians. My grandmother and her sisters were finally reunited with their parents. The worst was over for them. On September 23, 1945, my grandmother married her fiancé George Satt-Murray in Budapest. George had managed to escape from a camp called Theresienstadt, stealing a bicycle and cycled all the way back to Budapest. My grandfather did not want to stay in Hungary after the war, as he saw a killer in every Hungarian man. So in September 1947 they went to Italy, leaving Hungary for good. They stayed in Rome for 2 years, and my grandmother got pregnant with her first daughter, my auntie Rita. While they were there, one of my grandfather's friends wrote to him convincing them to move to Sydney. He promised to send them a permit, however the permit only reached them 2 years later when they were in Paris, having just had a second daughter, my mother Evie. My mother was only 3 weeks old when the Satt-Murrays left the Italian port of Genoa, bound for Australia. They were on an Italian boat called the Sorrento, which arrived in Sydney on the 15th of March 1951. My grandfather established a pleating skirt business, and my grandmother worked alongside him making skirts. The business grew quickly and allowed them to afford a house in Eveley Street, Bondi Junction, and they moved there in July 1959. In 1967, my grandfather became very ill, and in July 1971 he passed away. My grandmother never remarried and has lived in that house until today. She is admired and respected by all and is the beloved matriarch of our family. She makes the best Hungarian food and is renowned throughout the community as a fantastic bridge player. And even at 95 years old, she plays 3 times a week. My grandmother sacrificed a lot to get to Australia and make a life for herself and her family, and I wouldn't be here today if she hadn't made those sacrifices. She continues to bring joy and happiness to our family, and I am lucky to have her in my life.
As my sins flow down the Jordan, oh, I want to come here and give you every part of me.